Hey everyone, Josh Neighbors here, Locked On Big 12 podcast. Today is the 10th of January, 2022. And on today's show, we go over TCU getting routed historically by Georgia, 65-7 in the national championship game. Congratulations to the Dogs. We'll break down what happened. What does it mean for the Big 12? What does it mean for TCU? A lot of talking points and things being bandied around right now. There's a whole lot to get to as it pertains to last night's national title.
You are Locked On Big 12, your daily podcast on the Big 12 Conference, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Once again, Josh Neighbors here, Locked On Big 12 podcast. Thank you guys for subscribing to the channel. If you all have not yet, please do. We are now above 300 or 3,000 subscribers. Help us get to 4,000. Please subscribe today. To all of those of you out there who joined us on the Twitter space last night, it was a lot of fun. The reason there was no post-game show was because, number one, TCU lost, but also we were on that Twitter space for a long time, so a lot of fun. If you want to get involved in those, make sure you guys follow me on Twitter at LOBig12. You guys can also follow me at JoshNeighbors_. I think I'll start doing those weekly so we can talk about some big picture stuff. We talked about some specific stuff, some big picture stuff. It's actually a pretty good conversation last night. So make sure you all find us on Twitter at LOBig12, and you guys can find me at JoshNeighbors_. Find the show wherever you all get your podcasts. All right. So last night, historic beating came TCU's way. Georgia hammers TCU in the national championship game. The final score was 65-7. Georgia could basically score. They did score whenever they wanted to. 32 first downs to just 9 for TCU. They were 9 for 13 on third down. They had 589 yards of offense. They got 12 yards per pass play, nearly 6 yards per rush play. They forced 3 turnovers. They had the ball for majority of the game. This was all one-way traffic. This looked like a lot of the mismatches that we have talked about time in and time out when it comes to SEC teams versus maybe, other competition. And sometimes the other competition can be in their league, and sometimes the other competition is out of their league. TCU did some really awesome things against Michigan. They did put some stuff to bed about, can certain teams compete on certain days against certain teams? Yes. But on the whole, the narratives about stars mattering, about talent mattering, all that stuff reigned true because Georgia got everything they wanted everywhere on the field. We knew the tight ends were going to be a huge problem for TCU. They were. And I love to see the breakdown stuff, but it felt like Georgia knew that they could get everything they wanted outside the tackles. They did a great job blocking, a lot of yards after contact. And you even saw the first touchdown, Stetson Bennett outside the tackle. Just TCU, they were the ones who were more confused on defense last night. They were the ones who were slower to react. Georgia were the ones who were, really, they were the ones who were kind of punching first. And TCU gets that score to make it 10-7. You kind of think game on, but Georgia just really would not be denied on this night, and generally speaking. So let's go there with Georgia. Just a dynasty now. 2 national championships is very difficult to do. I forgot how many schools have done it. But Kirby, what he has built, if you look at the recruiting rankings, he's stacked great classes. He's got good coordinators. He's developed talent. And I thought the greatest trick that Nick Saban ever pulled was minimizing in some ways the importance of that quarterback position. I think he did that with Jacob Coker, right? Jacob Coker as the quarterback on their championship team, to me, was always a really impressive feat because that guy was not like this awesome quarterback, right? It's not really what we remember Jacob Coker for. And I'm not saying they minimize that. I think last year, especially, they minimized that, but making this offense so good that all the trigger man Stetson Bennett has to, and look, he played an awesome game last night, but Stetson Bennett last year was not this excellent player. This year he got a lot better, but he did struggle in a bunch of games. It didn't matter though, because this team is so well-rounded, but there's so much talent and ability on this team that it is hard to mess it up. And that's why it made it so noticeable in the mind of Kirby Smart when he did mess it up. He has been fantastic in big games. If you look at Stetson Bennett's resume and his record, like, where are the games that he has really showed up in, especially if you look at this season? Well, he was really strong in their opener against Oregon, 25 at 31 for 368 and 2 scores. He ran for a touchdown in that game. Also, the running part of his game is really underrated. You go and you look later on in the Mizzou game, he ends up playing really well, but did not play well for most of that game. Then you go and you look, that Tennessee game was 17 for 25 for 257, 2 scores, and then also 1 on the ground. You go and you look at the LSU game, fantastic in that one, 79% completion percentage, 274, 4 touchdowns in the air. Ohio State, he rallies, nearly throws for 400 yards, 3 touchdowns and runs for 1. And then TCU, 18 for 25, 304, 4 scores in the air, 2 on the ground. The guy really does elevate his game. Now, like the shot he'll get in the NFL, I've got no clue, but he started off as just like a quarterback in college, became a very good college quarterback, and now is a great college quarterback. That is the story of Stetson Bennett. And look, if you put Max Duggan on that team, on the Georgia team, I'm sure he does very, very well, but that's not the case. Stetson Bennett's on that team. He had to work his way back there. He had to hold off as many 5 stars or take the job, I guess, in some cases from his 4 and 5s and hold off 4 and 5s his entire time that he was playing there, right? That is part of his story. And so that is on him for his leadership ability, for making guys believe in him, stuff that we talked about Max Duggan has, and also for his quality of play. Stetson Bennett is a very good player, right? A lot of guys do all that offense. He really does, though, seem at times to get the most out of it. Kirby Smart has done a great job with this. And once again, they've not minimized it, but they've made it to where it's hard. I know DeJuan Mathis struggled, but like it's hard not to play well in that system. It's really difficult to be bad. I'm not saying that's, once again, his job is super easy, but it's difficult to suck at quarterback at Georgia. But Stetson, like, not only does he not suck, I mean, these big games, he is absolute nails for them. We saw it in the Natty last year. We saw it in the Natty this year. He's a guy you want the ball in his hands. Like, that's just the way you want it. And so they were able to rip apart TCU's defense. They were better up front. From that standpoint, and then on defense too, they were faster, and TCU's just making too many mistakes early on in this game. Very uncharacteristic. TCU looked intimidated, and Georgia pounced. And when Georgia pounces, it can get very, very ugly. The next part, and like once again, Georgia now the new standard in all of college football. The next part of this I want to get to on TCU's side of things. I've seen this brought up. Is that, would you rather be like, I saw Craig Smoke tweeted it out, and I like the guys over at Sikkim 365 Sports, but would you rather be like Baylor's season last year and beat Ole Miss in the Sugar Bowl, or what TCU went through this year? And I've seen a lot of the, would you rather not go and not get crushed, right? Or would you rather go and get crushed? And I really think it's a ridiculous conversation to have. I think this will be like the one of maybe I'll talk about it with Robbie Triano when we record, but we should not give any credence to that. Like, I would much rather be a Big 12 team in a national championship game. I would much rather see my team in a national title game than not. Like, Baylor last year lost a really ugly game to Oklahoma State. And they lost, and then they lost the Chandler Morris. I would call it the Chandler Morris YOLO game, where he came out of nowhere and just torched them. And they end up winning the Big 12 championship in the goal line. They end up winning the Sugar Bowl. That's great. That's awesome. But TCU, their 13-1 was magical. You beat your rival in that game-winning field goal. You don't win the Big 12 championship, but you still get in the playoff. When you get to the playoff, you cash in. If TCU had gotten hammered in the playoff, then I would still say I'd rather have TCU's season. But even, that's more of a conversation there. But TCU did something that a Big 12 team has not done yet. Even the likes of Oklahoma, which we think is, has kind of closed the gap to other schools more so, the talent and whatnot. TCU went and they beat a college football playoff team. That Michigan team was not going to beat Georgia. I'll tell you that right now after what we just saw. And they went in there and they were more physical than a team for Michigan whose calling card was them being physical. And I've already seen the excuses about Jim Harbaugh looking for his next job and whatnot. I mean, that guy is a football coach. I know he's hunting and searching for his next job, but he wants to win. Everybody involved wants to win. And TCU goes and wins that game. Was last night embarrassing? Yeah, it was really embarrassing. Is it another loss you stack up for, the Big 12, like for K-State against Alabama and, for Georgia, against TCU? Yeah, sure. But that's not a problem unique to TCU. It's just not their issue. Like it's a problem that is unique for a lot of schools. We saw, Oregon went and got crushed by this Georgia team in week number 1. They didn't have 10 days to prepare. They had an entire offseason to prepare for Georgia, and they still got crushed. I know TCU got crushed worse on a bigger stage, but still, like this stuff does happen. There is a gap that we have to meet. Think about it. As fun as Lincoln Riley and USC were this year, like guys, Tulane put up however many points on USC. Like Utah dragged them twice. Like there are these gaps that the problem is a lot. Like they would not close that gap either. USC would get absolutely just hammered by Georgia. They might score some more, right? Than TCU did, but they get absolutely hammered. And so this is not a problem unique to TCU. Like TCU, yeah, the loss was embarrassing, but if you're a TCU fan, like you should not feel embarrassed generally about your season. Any conversation about, hey, should Alabama be there? Well, win your freaking games. Like that's what you have to do. You have to go and win your games. People were talking about Michigan in this unbelievable way after they beat Ohio State, right? They met Ohio State, who's got a lot of talent, a lot of guys who are physical. They met them at the line of scrimmage. They pushed them around and they kicked their ass in their building. You give that team weeks and weeks to prepare for TCU, and TCU was the more prepared team. They were the faster team that day, and they were the more physical team that day. And then the rubber met the road, and TCU could not close the gap. But any idea like TCU should be embarrassed about how their season went, or I'd rather be a Baylor fan. I'd rather have season X or season Y. Guys, this is the most successful season in modern Big 12 history. This one right here. Oklahoma's champ. I mean, if you want to take the modern, let's just go college football playoff era. This is the most successful Big 12 season that we have had from a team. And it ends with 2 losses. They didn't win the Big 12 conference, but they did win a playoff game, which is something that had not been done before by a Big 12 team. This is the most successful season. They got all the way since the playoffs been come around. It's not happened yet. And what TCU did in that one game is they showed it's possible to a certain extent, to a certain point. But when we take these games out of the week to week like schedule, right? So Georgia struggles against Missouri. And they struggle against Kentucky a little bit. And TCU struggles against West Virginia. And Michigan struggles against Illinois, right? Those all happen within the context of a season, like a week-to-week grind that you are on. When you take it out of that context and you put them in these spots and you put them in these neutral stadiums and you put them in these places, like the games have a different feel to them. And when you do that, I think the talent gap just feels like it gets more magnified because there's so much more pomp and circumstance, so much more discussion. There's so much more focus, right? Like the entire staff for Georgia is all focused on TCU. There's nobody who's looking ahead. Nobody's scouting ahead. All the polos are on, thinking about TCU. Same way for TCU against Georgia. But when that happens and you have a team like Georgia, it is easier to exploit your advantage. Georgia didn't have, there was no super clear talent advantage either way, I thought, in the Georgia-Ohio State game. And I mean composite overall. Like Georgia, their defense is better than Ohio State's defense. I would say Ohio State's offense for most of that game with Howard Harrison was a little better. Obviously, they were on the third string, fourth string running back too, right? So I think that, games like that, there's not a huge gap, and the thing came down to the wire. We had a missed field goal that sent Georgia on their way. That the fact that TCU beats Michigan, TCU had to bridge a talent gap, right? If you look over the last 4 years, their recruiting compared to Michigan's, Ohio State's, and Georgia's, TCU's not a bad recruiting school, but it is worse. And so those gaps do get magnified, which makes, once again, TCU's performance against Michigan a bit more impressive. Then you apply to Georgia. And look, I thought TCU would be close just because I hadn't seen them play a game. It was, we hadn't seen them play a game that wasn't close. But with no Kendra Miller in there, and it's not a huge excuse, but like they couldn't run the ball physically downhill. They don't have that punishing back, a guy who could kind of punch for them against UGA. That was a huge issue for TCU. They obviously could not run the ball physically the way they wanted to. They looked small. They looked outmatched. They were small. They were outmatched in that game. Which gets us to this next point of like, how do Big 12 teams bridge the gap between them and everybody else? And I think this is something that we're going to explore now in the coming seasons. And this is sad that I have to say this, and I think TCU is actually a school that could maybe break this mold eventually. I think there are not many schools that are going to be in the Big 12 that can bridge this talent gap when it comes to like a college ball playoff setting like we just saw. It's just the truth. Like, I think Kansas State's of the world. I think Iowa State's of the world. I think the BYU's of the world. I think the Oklahoma State's of the world. I think the Texas Tech's of the world. Like, I think a lot of these schools are going to have a tough time closing those gaps. And it's not unique to them, but because of where they're positioned and like what their great teams have to look like. Like for Kansas State, their great teams, are physical at the line of scrimmage. And, they get players like Deuce Vaughn, who is an outlier and who is missed. And they have, good tight ends and they've got good special teams play. And they play Alabama and then the talent takes over and they get rolled. And TCU does a lot of stuff really well. They take on a Georgia team and look, it's a dynasty type team and they get rolled. But that's who's going to be in the championship games. Like, guys, look at the last few recruiting classes that Alabama has had. Look at those recruiting classes. They look like the ones that Georgia's putting together. Georgia, I think it was like first, second, fourth, and first. It's really hard to compete with on a given year. It's extremely difficult to compete with. And I don't think there's going to be many Big 12 schools that can do it. I think TCU and Baylor could have shots at it. I think Houston, because of where they're located, once they get like deep into the Big 12, could have a shot at it. I think UCF, if they keep a guy like a Gus Malzahn because of where they're located, has a shot at it. But like, they're going to have to recruit at an insanely high level. They're going to have to nail the transfer portal at an insanely high level. And it's all going to have to come together for them. Because right now, like, guys, look at who's dominating. It is the SEC. It's dominating. They are the best conference. There is no doubt about it. And it's tough whenever they play. Like, it feels like it's almost a different sport sometimes. We saw it in the Kansas State game against Alabama. We saw it in the game last night. And I don't have answers on how to close that gap. I really don't. I was talking to some of the folks who are Oklahoma State fans last night and like being like, you got to get the right guides, got to cultivate culture. But like, yeah, how far does that take you though? How far does culture take you? Dabo Swinney was able to pull it off at Clemson, which is absolutely remarkable. But Clemson wasn't like awful before, right? There's a pretty decent recruiting school. And they ended up getting the talent. And they ended up getting guys like generational guys like Trevor Lawrence and generational talents, the defensive line. Florida State was able to do it. It's a Florida school. It's why I pinpointed UCF. Like that stuff's possible. There are ways to do it. But does anybody look at any of the Big 12 schools and think like we're super close? TCU was close. TCU was on the edge. They were in the national championship game. And look, maybe if it's Ohio State, it's a bit of a different story, right? And maybe TCU is able to score more if that is the game. But it was against Georgia, and we thought it could be close because that's the way TCU plays, and they just got blown off the field. Absolutely blown off the field in historic fashion. So I'm not saying the Big 12 doesn't matter. I'm not saying it's relevant. I'm just saying the big question is like, how do we bridge the gap now? That's the big question is, how can Big 12 schools figure out ways to bridge the gap between them? And look, if you put it in a 60-minute setting, it's possible. It's doable. But you have to make it there through the full season to put yourself in position. Kansas State needed those losses to figure. Maybe the Texas loss was superfluous because of Will Howard's situation. You want to see him playing earlier in the year. But like that team needed all that stuff to forge who they were, to win the Big 12 championship. And they get smoked by Alabama. Right? TCU, forged by all these, close games and whatnot. They make it all the way to the end and they get blown off the field by Georgia. Stars matter, guys. Ari Wasserman says this all the time. Like this game is not a Disney movie. College football, Stetson Bennett stories may not be a Disney movie, but Jalen Carter is not a Disney movie. All those guys, Kyrus Jackson, not a Disney movie there. Brock Bowers, not a Disney movie. Lad McConkey's 3 stars, so, good for him. He's cooking. He was cooking last night. Right. But like all of that stuff, Darnell Washington, all the guys up front who were, felt slighted in not winning the Joe Moore Award, and they played a hell of a game for the Georgia Bulldogs. So all that stuff really matters. And I'm trying to figure out now, like what Big 12 schools can do to close the gap and which ones can actually do it. I'm not saying and once again, like this is the national championship game. This is the biggest stage. This is all, this is the one game that we're focusing on. We're talking about, like, Texas Tech football is still important. Kansas State football is still important. Oklahoma State football is still important. Iowa State football is still important. KU football is still important. How we got here is still important. But I'm talking about in settings like these, how do we close the gap? How do we close the gap? Because recruiting at the level that Big 12 schools are recruiting at right now is not possible to close the gap, particularly to the SEC, particularly when it comes to speed, right? Like the only reason Ohio State, and I know you can beat them physically sometimes, but like the only reason Ohio State, was in a tight game with Georgia is because they have the speed. They have the athletes on the outside to make plays, and a quarterback is going to be a top 2 guy, right? They have all of those things. Now, they get beat by Michigan, who is a both physical and talented team, not as talented, but more physical team. So they have the right combination of both physicality and talent. But how does a team that does not make the blue chip ratio, once again, guys, the blue chip ratio is a majority of your roster is made up of 4 and 5 stars. In the modern college football playoff era, no team that is outside of 50%, 50+%, I'd say 4 and 5 stars has won a national championship game. It has not happened yet. That's what makes TCU beating Michigan the outlier. So then it becomes, how does it happen? How does a team like, and this is not just Big 12, but like, how do the Virginia Techs and the UVAs and the Marylands and the Purdues, these are even Big 10 schools, and the Missouris and the Washington States, the Oregon States, the Oregons, right? They recruited at a super high level. I'm not even sure they've been on the blue chip ratio recently. I think they've been at one point. Like, how do those schools eventually win? How do they do it? Because it's very, very difficult to do. My whole point here is do not take away from what TCU accomplished this season. Sure, it was an embarrassing loss, a very difficult loss for TCU. The season as a whole, though, not an embarrassment, right? Not an embarrassment at all. And this is a question that we're going to keep exploring more. Make sure you guys follow us on Twitter at LOBig12. You guys can find me at JoshNeighbors_. Make sure you guys subscribe to the channel, leave your comments as well. Till next time, my friends, as always, stay safe.